A chanson is in general any lyric-driven French song, usually polyphonic and secular. A singer specializing in chansons is known as a chanteur, or chanteuse. A collection of chansons, especially from the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, is also known as a chansonnier. Chanson de geste. The earliest chansons were the epic poems performed to simple monophonic melodies by a professional class of jongleurs or menestrels. These usually recounted the famous deeds of past heroes, legendary and semi-historical. The Song of Roland is the most famous of these. But in general the chansons de geste are studied as literature since very little of their music survives. Chanson courtoise. The chanson courtoise or grand chant was an early form of monophonic chanson, the chief lyric poetic genre of the Trouvères. It was an adaptation to Old French of the Occitan cancer. It was practiced in the 12th and 13th centuries. Thematically, as its name implies, it was a song of courtly love, written usually by a man to his noble lover. Some later chansons were polyphonic and some had refrains and were called chansons avec des refrains. A crusade song was known as a chanson de croisade. Burgundian chanson. In its typical specialized usage, the word chanson refers to a polyphonic French song of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. Early chansons tended to be in one of the formes fixes, ballad, rondeau or violet, though some composers later set popular poetry in a variety of forms. The earliest chansons were for 2, 3 or 4 voices, with first 3 becoming the norm, expanding to 4 voices by the 16th century. Sometimes, the singers were accompanied by instruments. The first important composer of chansons was Guillaume de Machaut, who composed 3 voice works in the formes fixes during the 14th century. Guillaume Dufay and Gilles Binchois, who wrote so-called Burgundian chansons, were the most important chanson composers of the next generation. Their chansons, while somewhat simple in style, are also generally in 3 voices with a structural tenor. Musicologist David Fallows includes the Burgundian repertoire in a catalogue of polyphonic songs 1415 to 1480. These works are typically still 3 voices, with an active upper voice pitched above 2 lower voices usually sharing the same range. Later 15th and early 16th century figures in the genre included Johannes Ockeghem and Josquin des Prez, whose works cease to be constrained by formes fixes and begin to feature a pervading imitation, similar to that found in contemporary motets and liturgical music. The first book of music printed from movable type was Harmonies Musicis Odicaton, a collection of 96 chansons by many composers, published in Venice in 1501 by Ottaviano Petrucci. Parisian chanson. Beginning in the late 1520s through mid-century, Claudin de Sermacy and Clement Genequin were composers of so-called Parisian chansons, which also abandoned the formes fixes, often featured 4 voices, and were in a simpler, more homophonic style. This genre sometimes featured music that was meant to be evocative of certain imagery such as birds or the marketplace. Many of these Parisian works were published by Pierre Attaignant. Composers of their generation, as well as later composers, such as Orlando de Lassis, were influenced by the Italian madrigal. Many early instrumental works were ornamented variations on chansons, with this genre becoming the canzone, a progenitor of the sonata. Modern chanson. French solo song developed in the late 16th century, probably from the aforementioned Parisian works. During the 17th century, the air de cour, chanson pour boire and other like genres, generally accompanied by lute or keyboard, flourished, with contributions by such composers as Antoine Boisset, Denis Gautier, Michel Lambert, and Michel Richard de Lalande. During the 18th century, vocal music in France was dominated by opera, but solo song underwent a renaissance in the 19th century. First with salon melodies and then by mid-century with highly sophisticated works influenced by the German Lieder, which had been introduced into the country. Louis Niedermeyer, under the particular spell of Schubert, was a pivotal figure in this movement, followed by Edouard Lalo, Félicien David and many others. Born of the cafés, concerts and cabarets of the Montmartre district of Paris and influenced by literary realism and the naturalist movements in literature and theatre, Chanson réaliste was a musical style which was mainly performed by women and dealt with the lives of Paris's poor and working class. Among the better-known performers of the genre are Mia Frehel and Edith Piaf. Later 19th-century composers of French art songs, known as mélodie and not chanson, included Ernest Chausson, Emmanuel Chabrier, Gabriel Fauré, and Claude Debussy, while many 20th-century and current French composers have continued this strong tradition. Nouvelle chanson. In France today, chanson, or chanson française, typically refers to the music of singers such as Charles Trenet, Guy Béjart, Jacques Brel, Jean Ferrat, Georges Brassens, Edith Piaf, Charles Aznavour, Barbara Delida, Serge Reggiani, Elie Couto-Ferré, Michel Arion, Mireille Mathieu and Serge Gainsbourg, and more recently Mano Solo, Dominique, Matthew Chédid, Benjamin Biolay, Jean-Louis Murat, Mayarsek, Mathieu Bougres, Daniel Darc, Vincent Delham, Maureen, Zaz, Benabar, Christina Go, Renan Luce, Olivia Ruiz. Chanson can be distinguished from the rest of French pop music by following the rhythms of French language, rather than those of English, and a higher standard for lyrics.